site locations are doing like significant expansions.
Yeah, yeah.
This one is like an expansion of the like vestibule.
You don't have to work.
It's so not what I envisioned. And I was on like the original building committee when we planned that building. It's planned like one of the walls is just disposable.
Oh,
And you can like
okay.
knock it out and double the size.
Oh, wow.
And so instead of doing that, we're like doing this other thing, and we're going to eventually just destroy that. And I think it was instead of like don't stand there, do something.
Yeah, yeah.
And like I had some conversations before they broke ground. I was like I get you want to see something, people want to see, but sensible here.
Make good
Yeah,
decisions.
correct. Motion for motion's sake. But that's okay. Whatever.
It is what it is.
I'm gonna be here for the first time.
Are we good?
So moved.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Did I turn my mic off? I did indeed. Hello. Okay, approval of agenda approved. Second item, approval of minutes, August 1st, 2024 Planning Commission meeting. Any comments? That was a big one. Okay, is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved. Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? All right. Now we invite members of the public to speak directly to the Planning Commission. If you would like to speak, please step up to the microphone, state your name and address. All right. Okay. Item PC 2024-1001, zoning code amendment for short-term conditional use permits. Shu?
Yep. Good evening, Chair and Commission members. In front of you is the zoning code amendment for the process for our current short-term conditional use permit. The short-term conditional use permit is a process that's being established throughout the code. Some of them are in different titles. The ones in front of you to be considered are all in the Title 17, which is zoning code. That's what this particular commission is authorized to make recommendation to City Council. So it was first brought up by City Council members to talk about amending the process to allow staff to approve short-term conditional use permit. Our existing process requires City Council to approve the short-term conditional use permit without first refer to Planning Commission. So that's one of the reasons you guys have never seen this type of particular applications. This particular application often are referred as special event permit. So like if there are a carnival, whether it's on private property or on public property, normally there are particular uses that's not established as permanent use, as indicated in the certificate of occupancy for the temporary circumstances. So, such as car shows, our Snake Saturday, and promotional venues, and of course, we do have temporary off-site construction yards and offices. So, in front of you, we are proposing some amendment to this particular process to allow staff to approve short-term conditional use permit with some exceptions. These exceptions include 3 different types of situations. One is if it's located in downtown area and above 500 attendees. And another situation is if it's located in downtown area and involving any public street closure. And and the third situation is whenever the city administrator determines there's a need for staff to refer this to city council. So with all that said, I'm open to any questions you might have or discussions. Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I don't see an appeal process in here. Is that listed somewhere else in the code?
Yes, typically there is appeal process, but since this is a staff administrative approval, normally the appeal would go to city council for
like-
this particular one, because it doesn't go to planning commission.
But I guess where is that written?
It does not specifically call it out. I believe there is a general language about this particular process in the code. I have to do a little more research.
Okay, so I guess I would just add, want to make sure that's included somewhere. And if it's already somewhere else in the code, in that section, it may be. I didn't have that either. Want to make sure that's in there. The other point I want to make is also making sure we have quick turnaround on these as well. You know, part of the process is also making sure it's shorter. I want to make sure it's actually a shorter process for our businesses.
Yes.
Sometimes the processing can drag along. So I mean, ultimately, and I don't have a number, at some point would like to have some sort of shot clock on this for the city as well. Say we need to get these back out the door, either approved or rejected within so many days. Those are my first two. That's all I got for now, though.
Yeah, I do want to mention that Megan brought up. We do currently have the planning application where these short-term conditional use permit, they file. There are particular languages on there about the appeal process that they can appeal to city council, that we can make that a standard operation procedure, just like what we do for other applications.
Just to provide a little context on this, when it says the city council asked for this, that was pretty much me hammering on this because it's a pretty lengthy process once it has to come into staff and then they have to do all their due diligence and they compile a report. Well, then there's the consideration for when is the next council meeting. It could be up to 2 weeks away. And so the fact that I can't remember in my, that's almost 5 years on council, ever saying no to a conditional use permit. Or going against staff's recommendation. So this would significantly shorten the timeline. That's kind of what the mayor was pointing at is that's really a goal here. And then if there is a need to bring it to us, it gives that exception via the city administrator or special conditions. Then if staff says no and the people want to appeal, bring it back to the city council. So that's kind of the overarching context of how we got here.
Red, it's on.
All right, we're good. No, my question was more about ensuring there's some kind of, and I think it fits in a little bit with what Councilman Smith's saying, but some kind of ongoing monitoring report from the office that approves these so that it shows, simply what was asked for, when the application came in, the intake date, and when it was approved, or if it's not approved yet, so that somebody's, specifically the council's, continually tracking, monitoring, so,
Yeah.
what's going to happen or what we say or think is going to happen, happens.
We do have that data, actually. We did put all the inquiries, our current inquiries in, and we'll continue putting those in about those, so you can see the approval time. How long does it take? Sometimes it's because of the submittal, the package itself is incomplete, but usually, like Councilmember Smith and Mayor mentioned earlier, there is a drag of time because of the council agenda. They only meet twice a month. So currently, we do require them to apply at a minimum 21 days before the event to meet the agenda. So this way, it will lift up some of the burden on staff to have to deal with the customer.
Oh, thank you. I don't know if it needs to be listed in the ordinance, but I guess my ask would be, and kind of I think what you're saying there, maybe not, is just having a list of pending and approved applications on every council agenda, kind of the status of every single one. And I don't know, again, if that needs to be listed in the ordinance necessarily, but just something to throw out there. I think it'd be good for everyone to be able to see and have that information publicly available for everything in process, basically.
Got it. We don't have to put it in the ordinance because this is particular regulations, but we can do those as a staff report to put those on the council agenda when there is a chance for
Yeah.
council agenda. But just keep in mind, sometime there might be, an event going on before it can even get to the
Yeah.
council agenda. But we'll try to capture that month what happened and what is about to happen. And I can work with our city administrator to
Yeah.
put that under the staff report.
And I only debate on ordinance because sometimes things do fall off over time. Like you may do it, but then at some point you'll have another community development director, hopefully way down the road, and then things just do drop off over time. And governing bodies change all the time, and we say that, and then things do just kind of fall. The fourth one I have, now that I remember what it is, what I guess initiated the changing of temporary parking from being a city council. So I'm trying to think. Most of the rest I understand, but this shows temporary parking also switching to administrator, I mean, from city council.
I believe that was a discussion from the council's direction.
Yeah, I just couldn't remember exactly where.
I believe staff said we would have preferred council to approve this one. And then council said, no, staff can approve this one. So I retrieved the,
As I stare at the red line, I probably go back to council. But
yes.
Okay.
But I'm okay of changing it back to city council if that's what the recommendation would be from. the
ultimately on that one, I
planning
probably land
commission.
is indifferent. But that was just one I noted enough to.
Right.
note, I guess.
Just give you a heads up on the data itself. Since I have been here, we have not had one exceptional case
Okay,
for
that's
this
what
particular situation.
Yeah, and I don't
yet.
recall.
And
having
yes,
one.
we are very strict on the particular justification
Mm-hmm.
why we should grant exceptions. So it's not like everybody comes with a four-wheeler truck on their driveway, say, I need to extend this. We would have granted.
Yeah.
I have not heard any applications
Yeah.
coming through.
I,
And
no,
if-
it's just as I read that, that's one of those things that once you hit the 14 days, even after an extension, can be a touchy subject in a neighborhood sometimes. But there we go, if it occurs.
So just clarify procedurally what's going on here. This is formerly something that our body, the Planning Commission, was responsible for, and we're taking that and moving it to administrative decision.
No.
Okay,
This is a formerly responsible action by city council
Okay.
for all different kinds of short-term conditional use permit. You have never seen this before, and you would have not seen these in the future neither. And now we're saying take about 75% of that to just end up at staff level.
and this is just Planning Commission's endorsement of that move.
Right, it's
Okay.
your recommendation because a portion of this
The
regulation
zoning,
is
gotcha.
embedded in zoning code.
Gotcha.
So you're obligated and authorized to make a recommendation, to make any code amendment.
Okay. Any further comments?
So I guess
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Please.
Okay, thank you. So council can still make modifications, and it doesn't have to necessarily come back to planning commission either, right? This is just a recommendation. As
Yes, this
normal
is
items. Okay.
just a recommendation. Council can still make a modification to the changes, and council can still refer the modification to be back to
Yeah.
planning commission if they wish the planning commission to hear the modification again.
Yeah, which I mean, generally, I'd assume if there's minor modifications, probably go through council. If something severe
Right.
happen, or I guess more
Yep.
of a heavy change, you'd probably
Disruptive.
recommend coming back to council. Yeah, or coming back to planning. All right, there we go. Sorry.
Just so I'm clear, so how were the exceptions arrived at? Because I know, like you mentioned, a couple exceptions. Downtown was part of both of them, I believe. But how were those numbers
So
arrived at, let's say?
they're about 25% on average. I gave you data, I believe, in the memo over there, retrieving the former applications we have received from 2021 and up to this year, and then take a look at the average and see what they fall under for each category. I would just say it goes about 25% to 50% for those exceptions. Depends on the year. Most of those big ones we know, Snake Saturday, they're over 500 and they close the street and they're in downtown area. So that one, we knew every year we have this one. And then there might be one or two of the other events that involve that. So I would just say average about 25% for those exceptions that need to go to city council. That's why I mentioned earlier, this will cut 75% of the application to be staff approval.
Okay.
Any further comments? I now open the public hearing for PC 2024-1001. Any members of the public that wish to speak?
You don't have to turn too hard there. There's no one.
I now close the public hearing for PC 2024-1001. Is there a motion for PC 2024-1001? We can move to approve with conditions, or pause, or vote to disapprove.
Not recommend.
Yes, to not recommend.
Declined to recommend.
Move to approve.
Any second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed, say no. Okay. I believe PC 2024-1001 passes. Do you need to get out of here? Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you. We're going to talk about zoning more. Thank you, commissioners. Next on the agenda, we have PC 2024-1002, residential parking requirement discussion.
Good evening, everyone. In front of you, there is a package on your table. It's a hard copy of the PowerPoint slides. So if you have a hard time of reading those little words, I can plug in the computer and it will show up on your screen. But I don't anticipate you to read every single word anyway. I'll explain what these are, and we can go down a deep dive of the zoning code and discuss about what we currently have, and if there is any issue, what are the solutions could it be. So just to kind of refresh everybody's memory, this particular discussion item came as sparked by a neighborhood meeting that hosted by the school district regarding a potential proposal to demolish a church and 2 existing houses next to it in order to transform the use into a surface parking lot in the residential zoning district. So question came as, do we allow parking in residential zoning district? If so, what are the requirements? Why do we allow it? Should we ban it? How do we ban it? And so I just want to give everybody a little background here real quick. And then fast forward to our current zoning map. Again, we need to show the land use through the zoning map. You cannot go without a zoning map, just talking about the zoning code. So right in front of you, if you kind of get to the 4th slide over here, there's a colorful map. And that shows you our existing zoning districts. So the residential zoning districts are all in the yellow beige color, going from very light yellow beige color all the way to the dark brown. And you can see generally they are covering the traditional Avenue neighborhood, including our Macon Park. And there are some higher density residential district also located in 1 North Development Area, which now we refer as Armour Road Redistrict Area. And also the existing Oxbow apartments. You can see that on the particular map. So from all these zoning districts that's zoned residential, it includes R1A, R1B, R2, R3, R4, and R5. So for R1A and R1B, they're referred as single-family residential zoning district. A lot of people think that means you can only have one detached house, but what it really means, it is built for 1 dwelling unit per lot. That's what it meant at that time. And we're, with the exceptions and legal non-conforming uses, spread it out in our traditional neighborhood. And then R2, R3, R4, R5 generally allows other residential building types, including small apartments, row homes, and big or medium apartments as well. So in our current public parking situation, which was referred in the existing parking management plan as an addendum to our 2016's master plan, we have talked about downtown parking management. And keep in mind that particular parking management plan only covers downtown area defined by the master plan. It does not include our residential area. That particular parking management plan did show there is sufficient parking for businesses, and the intention for that parking management plan is to make sure we have enough parking that can support our local businesses for a vital economic activities over there. However, I would like to show you, because this particular public parking map is relevant to our traditional neighborhood that's embedded next to the downtown and surrounding the downtown area. This information is available on our website. I had my staff, Megan, helped us to make this parking map accurate and available for the public. If you have any question, let us know. So currently, we have several lots scattered through the downtown business area, including some civil lots, like the parking lot in front of the library, the parking lot by City Hall, and the city-owned parking lot. And we're showing what are the operation time frame that's allowed for public parking. We also have those kind of purplish lines, linear lines over there, showing what are the 2-hour parking restrictions on our streets currently. So that can give you an idea about what are the regulations regarding to parking on the street and the availability for those.
Shu.
Yes. And as I'm going through this presentation, please feel free to raise your hand or
Sure.
let me know if you have questions.
Does this parking map show the ones that we lease for public parking?
Yes, it does.
Okay, because the lot that the church, that we rent from the church, and the one behind Screenland, those don't seem to be on there unless I'm looking at this wrong.
You're right. Those ones are not on this one. Maybe I got an old one.
So this is Armor.
Yeah.
Screenland would be
Yeah.
this side.
It's
That's north.
Oh, that is there. Okay. I'm a little off myself too. Yeah, it's where you see Erie on the right hand. That's the little orange one. That's the public parking.
This is, the blue one is this parking lot.
Yeah, the light blue one is the church.
Okay, all right, yeah, I'm totally.
We are kind of shifting a little, looking probably as Swift over
you are.
there. See, yeah, I got a little confused.
Okay,
myself,
thank
too.
you.
Mhm. Okay. Is that cleared?
Yes, thank
Okay.
you. I was-
We just recently we just amended the contract with the church, so that still stays there.
Yep.
Nothing changes. And so move on to the next slide. I would like to talk about 17.12 first, because that relates to what our general saying about zoning districts and what are the allowed uses over there. So chapter 17.12 establishes all the residential zoning district and particularly regulates what are the allowed uses and building types per the residential district. And as you can see, R1A and R1B are single-family residential, whether it's traditional or compact. R2, we call those two-family residential. In R3, they're clustered or garden apartments. And R4 is mixed-density neighborhood. R5 is multifamily residential. And then, so for additional purposes over to residential uses, I would like to kind of remind everybody we had a code amendment not long ago about the ADUs. They're the accessory dwelling unit. And we also added additional parking requirements to the accessory dwelling unit. We require one additional parking space per the ADU that is to be provided on site, which means the on-street parking spaces would not be counted toward this requirement. So that was one thing that was done at that time when the code was written. And then fast forward to this particular fund table, the use table. If you have not seen it, I encourage you to look at that in the zoning code. It's a very fun big table. listed out all the primary uses. And again, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about primary uses, principal uses. Parking often is seen as an accessory use to support the functionality of any primary uses because how largely American populations are depending on automobiles, such as schools, you have parking lots. But we don't call that is a primary use because that is a functionality to support the everyday operation. Any medical office, grocery stores, those are all accessory uses. Generally, we require accessory uses to be located on the same lot with the principal uses. However, campus-style development is an exception. We talked about this before. This is how the school district approached to us, and that is allowed use at that time, as an explained. With that said, most of the time, if you're looking at residential districts, for all the allowed uses in a residential district, the vehicle parking as a primary use is not allowed in any residential district. As you can see on the use table particularly, that's why I pulled out the primary use for vehicle parking. So from R1A all the way to R5, it is not permitted use. So you're not going to have a residential house turned down and turned into a paid parking lot tomorrow. That's just not going to happen unless they rezone the particular lot first,
Or if it was the school.
or if it is a campus style.
Because of the campus. And that, so I know we've got a lot of stuff here, and I'm happy to have this discussion because it's a good topic to dig deep in. But the real concern is that the school could continue to find more opportunities to do this, and our current default stance is yes, because it's permitted under the campus-style development. What I would prefer to see is our default stance be no, unless you can prove a really valid reason, rather than yes, unless these problems arise and we had a whole public outcry and there's going to be, adverse impact on neighboring. So the real struggle for the people who live there was we really don't have the choice to say yes or no unless we can prove all these other things and that whole laundry list of stuff that we had to kind of walk through. I'd rather it be just a no unless they petition for an exception. And then that would come to us and we could say, well, does it make sense in the neighborhood or not? But they wouldn't be able to go out and buy a parcel and assume that it would become a parking lot. That would just be okay. That's kind of where I was hoping to get with the discussion so that it wasn't a constant.
A different angle that I also had a question, and I was remembering the school, discussions we had. One of the documents the school had said, we're only at so many spaces, but to meet the minimum, we need to be at some number. Is the minimum for where the school is the correct number? Or have we put something in place that needs to be revisited because that number is just not attainable as a minimum?
I think there's kind of two separate issues.
We'll
One,
get to the point.
yeah,
When
one,
we get to that part.
one is the parking minimums generally, kind of
Generally,
across
yeah.
the board.
Same.
And then the second one is the primary use within R1 zoning district, depending on its inclusion in a campus and the definition of the campus. But by right, currently, barring the kinds of issues that we encountered in this particular case, by right, the school district would be able to do this type of development for a parcel that they acquired, to do a parking lot as a primary use within the context of the campus. So those are kind of the two main issues that I think we're finding friction in terms of applying the zoning code, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. I think we could move on maybe because parking requirement is somewhat a little complex itself. There are ratio requirements, there are zoning district requirements, and there are other factors I would like you to be aware before you get to the solution part. So if we want to move on, that would be good. So then the next part when we wanted to talk about the access and the parking is in chapter 17.28. It particular talks about what's the intent for for the requirement for access and parking when it's related to use. So it goes all the way back to the zoning history, like how parking becomes part of the zoning regulations, because it's largely associated with the use. Like I said, different uses generate different traffic, which has different demands of how many parking spaces you need. Like if you're a grocery, quick turnaround, if you're an office, if you're a daycare, if you're a library, how many of those parking spaces are required? So there is international zoning code that sets the tone for the general required ratio for zoning for the parking spaces based off the uses itself. And that's where we started. So there are a lot of national debate about whether or not we should even require the minimum parking in certain areas or in the city. If so, what should we do? If not, what should we do? Is this the city's job to maintain the parking spaces? Is this purely the private interest, and how are we going to address the overburdening of our street for on-street parking and with all the traffic conflicts over there? So trust me, it's not a one-night discussion. There's a lot of, moving pieces and all blends in. But generally, we laid out the intent over here for what this chapter is for. It is for emphasize the importance of a site access and the multiple modes of transportation. We already said here, we want to consider multiple modes of transportation, not just the car drivers, but also cyclists, pedestrians, and all the other users. We want to preserve the streetscape design and the street functions by coordinating the access and along and the internal to our blocks. And then we want to provide the optimal amount of vehicle parking for individual sites that we do recognize in Midwest, in our region. We do have large demand for vehicle parking spaces. That is a fact. And then number 4, we wanted to create access and parking standards appropriate to the context of the site. Like, I cannot have a small site where there is one residential dwelling unit and they wanted to build 10 parking spaces so they can charge other people for parking over there. That is offsetting the intent of what the on-site parking is for. And then we want to ensure that the appropriate site design features is embedded in there, because surface parking deal with a lot of stormwater runoff, and there is also noise and emission that we want to make sure there are buffers. And so generally this is why parking lot has landscape buffer requirements and from the adjacent properties. And we want to maximize the opportunities for on-street parking, shared parking, and we wanted to reduce the parking rates where it's appropriate and it's available. So there is portion of the parking code that allows shared parking, and they have to do certain studies to show us how they accommodate the uses based off the different dynamics of the customers and the operation of the business character. So with all that said, our hope is to kind of promote our parking designs and to serve the demand that we need, but also not oversupplying in our city. That's always easy to say, hard to do. So with all that being said, there is a portion of the code that talk about the applicability. We can now just go out to all the private sectors and tell them, or public sectors, tell them, now you have to apply this code to your parking lot today, right now, because there are legal non-conforming situations. There are also small changes and expansions that this particular code doesn't apply. So applicability over here is a pretty important section. It tells you in what circumstances these rules shall be applied. So I would like to run down those really quick. The first one is for all new development. Anything that started from scratch. When it's an undeveloped lot, you start from scratch, this rule applies to you. And then the second situation is when the change for use for an existing site or building happens, but only where the new use would require 20% more parking than what exists today. So if you're only adding, say, 5%, you're expanding your parking lot for 5% to accommodate the expansion of your building, this rule would not apply because it's such a small change. Only when it hits to 20%. And then we talked about when additional parking is required for an existing site or building, then the landscape and design standards shall only apply to the newly constructed parking. So buffers, bushes, trees, they only apply to the expanded and new parking area when the parking is required. They don't apply for what is already there exists because we acknowledge those are non-conforming, grandfathered in situation. And then the last situation over here is that the access standards shall not limit the location of any existing access unless in conjunction with a public streetscape project or the entire site is redeveloped, which means the existing granted curb cut access is existing. We cannot go tell them, go close it. I had people asking questions about some one of the school district parking site with some conflict of people turning into the wrong street, trying to make a turning. I won't go to the deep dive of that particular situation, but the question is, can we ask the school district close the driveway? The answer is typically we cannot because that was a permitted driveway approach. It exists already, unless there is a public street scape redone or redevelop of this particular site. Normally, we don't have the right to do so. And fair enough, in that particular situation, normally the access is required to maintain emergency vehicles circulation on the site. So that's why I want to mention that this parking rule only applies for all the other situations that I mentioned. And then in chapter 17.28, we also talked about minimum numbers of on-site parking that's required. We often refer as a parking ratio table. That's where Commissioner Spencer mentioned earlier how many parking spaces are required, how do they calculate all of that. So that's where the particular section is. It's in 17.28.030. So for detached houses or duplex, the requirement is 2 per dwelling unit. To be honest with you, it's pretty high, in my opinion. And as you know, we have a lot of non-conforming situations in our Avenue neighborhood because they're traditional neighborhood. They were built in a compact, on the compact lot with very small shed or detached garage in the backyard that usually cannot accommodate 2 cars. It doesn't mean they cannot provide 2 parking spaces, but in order for them to provide 2 parking spaces, they have to pave a driveway to accommodate 1 car maybe in the garage or 2 car on the driveway to dedicate that parking spaces. So if anybody is going to renovate the existing compact houses for a detached house in the Avenue, if it's over 50% of the market value is demolished, say if it goes all the way down to its foundation, somebody's rebuilding it, they have to comply with this code for a single family house that they have to provide at a minimum 2 parking spaces today, which we found it is what the appetite of the market at this point, because people do want 2 parking spaces per detached houses, but maybe this is something we can discuss in the future that don't make that a requirement. They can choose to have it or not. And I'm about to hit to the point where we also have a cap for maximum parking spaces as well. So let's move on. And then for row houses and apartments, we require 1.5 per dwelling unit. So it was about 5 years ago. I happened to deal with a case for a project in downtown area in Kansas City, in River Market. It is a very large apartment building. And I remember very clear, they have large incentives about reducing the number of parking spaces on site. So they're promoting 0 requirement for parking spaces. And the developer had to come with a study to justify saying they need a minimum 1.8, I believe, at that time, and now the number probably changes, per unit at that time. And the appetite for the governing body at that time is, why do you need that much? We don't want you, we encourage public transit. We have a lot, it's in the River Market, you have a streetcar, you have buses, you have a lot of other choices. and they come up with this market study about does the market say. So I remember very clearly at that time it was over 2 per dwelling unit. And again, that was 5 years ago. But I would suggest us, if we were to make any changes to the parking ratio, we should consider a thorough study for North Kansas City based off our residents and business needs before we make any changes. That's just something I want to put it up ahead. And I want to let you know that we are preparing for our master plan to be updated in this upcoming year. So I think that would be a good time for us to do a public engagement, see what does the resident and business think about the uses, where they can picture their vision of our future. What do they think about the parking? Are we short on it? Are we oversupplying it? And who wants to pay for it? Or should we continue paying for it? So I think before we do that, I don't recommend us to change these rates right away. This is something maybe for you to think about. And then for group living,
Real quick, I'm sorry. So we're redoing master plan 2025,
yes, that's the goal.
and does that mean we'll redo the zoning in 2028, 2027?
So typically, a master plan takes about a year,
Uh-huh.
and you will be the reviewing and recommending body for the master plan adoption process.
Right.
So how does that work is we don't have the in-house power. We don't have staff to draft the plan ourselves. So likely we'll have to contract it out
Right.
to do the master plan like what we did before in 2015. And then normally they take about a year. And for a master plan to be developed, there are a lot of components you can add on to it. I would suggest us to consider sustainability. And of course, for sustainability, like parking management is one thing we need to take a look, along with the other issues we have. I'm making a list right now. When that is done, I'm hoping if we start early in 2025, we could get the final draft maybe somewhere in summertime 2026, and then after the final draft is being reviewed, we'll forward that to our planning commission for reviewing and open public hearings and taking comments and making changes, and then finally we will forward that to city council. So hopefully we can get the final documents by the end of 2026, and likely there will be zoning code amendment associated with it. And we can talk a little bit more in other meetings about how master plans is tied to zoning regulations. So I would anticipate zoning regulations to be amended, not just like a periodic review, like what I do, a small section, a small change. There might be a massive amendment in a lot of big chapters. I would anticipate that probably sometime in maybe 2026 or 2027, like you mentioned earlier. Then that's where, you'll see all these. And then there are other regulations about, on-site parking ratios, like you all mentioned about the schools. What are the uses? What are the requirements? There are different ways you can calculate the required on-site parking for schools at that time. Our code writes says whichever is greater. So this is why they say our minimum requirement is this number, because you can run the requirement by 2 per classroom or 1 per 3 seats of any assembly area, or 1 per 5 students, whichever mechanism you use. It's going to be the greater number. The greatest number is what we actually take as a minimum requirement.
So if we ran those three, what do we know the numbers for those three? Because I feel like there's a giant outlier with the event parking.
It was the event parking.
Right, but how much higher is that than if you go, what was one, how many per classroom?
I can't remember that particular case. I apologize for not having
That's
that case
okay.
right in front of me. But I remember the rationale behind my head at that time because I reviewed the parking demand study they submitted.
Yeah.
I remember the rationale behind it is there is not a large shortage for their daily operation,
Yeah, not at all.
which means how you run by classroom or by students. But there is a significant demand when you're running the number by the number of seats in the assembly area, which are often referred as their football, basketball seasons when they are admitting the attendees. That's the number they use. And I believe that is, and you heard the school district comment, made their presentation about how they calculated that.
Right.
So that's where
I didn't
it
realize
fell
the
on-
other two were kind of check boxes, and then you could compare the three and take the greatest. Like I knew they got to a big number by using the assembly piece, but I didn't know the other two, and I'd be curious to see how far off.
Yeah,
third
but
one.
our code writes this way
Yeah.
though. Our code said whichever ever is greater. So they are actually doing it correctly per our
Sure.
code requirement. And then, there are other uses also associated with it. Normally for retail, like commercial uses and industrial uses based off the square footage of the building itself and number of employees. And so if you have questions, we can talk about those. But we do have a lot of somewhat historical storage area in our industrial uses that don't comply with the code, or they are struggling when they have transmission from the existing industrial uses to commercial uses, especially like eating and drinking establishments. If they were to convert it to restaurants, the required number of parking spaces for them is just not realistic in a lot of ways. And that's probably something we ought to kind of also take a look at how we want to address it through the master plan work.
So without diving too deep into the parking minimum discussion, which I think is a very warranted one to have in depth, but is that, as you're saying, like the restaurants would be struggling to convert an old space that didn't have the same requirement to a restaurant because there's not enough parking within, name your distances, 300 feet, 600 feet. This is kind of an economic development issue too, because we could attract more interesting restaurants, other businesses, but because they can't find the parking in our.
I'm not going to jump into that conclusion right away.
No, I
because-
am. I'm jumping
Okay.
straight to it.
No, don't jump into the conclusion right away because there's another portion of the code, and I will kind of give you a more thorough picture of
that
what
the-
our current code said.
The piece where we allow public spaces to count, on-street spaces to count at a
Exactly.
fraction and all. Yeah, it's crazy complicated. And having lived through the Oxbow debacle, capitalism finds a way to find the loopholes and then still not get the right number of spaces on the site. That's where like the gears grind in my head to say like this is so complex, but somebody's going to get in here if there's enough money on the table and figure out a way to underpark the site and then struggle down the road. I favor a solution where, like, if they're going to underpark their site and build it incorrectly, like, they suffer. It shouldn't be a city responsibility to make them build more spaces than may be necessary for one spot. But if they underpark their apartment building and they don't get residents, it's kind of their fault. But yeah, that's a whole nother deep dive conversation. But it does seem to be an economic development
Yeah.
situation.
I'd like to talk about the economic development part as well, and I'll get to the slide where we talked about parking reduction over there. The very first parking reduction allowable part, I feel like I'm jumping through some of those slides, which is okay, but we can get straight over there. The parking reduction, particularly we talked about over here, the first one that exempt from all the parking requirement is C2. And if you remember that colorful map I'm showing, C2 basically refers our existing downtown area. So we have no parking requirement at all. You can have 0 parking spaces. And that's somewhat, we see more problem than we see more benefits of this exemption, I would say from staff perspective. The reason I'm saying that is we could allow any uses allowed in the particular C2 zoning district without a single parking space being required over there. But down the road, the problem is they'll overburden our on-street parking. And they'll come to staff, and there will be congestion.
and there will be compliance, and they'll get to spread it out to other business areas or residential areas. So maybe this is something we kind of need to take a look in the future as well, I would just say. But because of that, I feel like if parking, the cost of parking is an overhand for an economic activity, I don't think that is a problem in our current downtown area. In other words, I feel like our current downtown area, we're doing whatever we can from parking perspective to lift up any burden for them to convert it to any uses that we encourage. Other areas might be a different story.
And that's what I'm thinking of is not our current downtown, but our future extended downtown
Exactly.
areas where, like, think down Swift and some of the warehouses are off of some of these other alphabetically named streets where people could do a thing, but they can't now because, parking.
Right. So we can talk about that. And again, that probably is a better work when we do our master plan. Then we have a better version of a better vision of what future uses we're talking about and where they're going to be after we engage with the businesses, because everybody has their own business plan. However they want to expand it, where they're looking for, we would like to hear that. And then so since we started talking about the parking reduction requirement over here, I'll get down the list. We have 5 different things over here. We already talked about C2 exempt, that we don't have any requirement for C2. And then the second one is on-street parking credit. So basically we're saying for any on-street parking spaces that's within 600 feet of any lot frontage, we will count 0.33 space per one space for you. Say if you have a large street frontage and they have 10 on-street parking spaces over there within 600 feet of your street frontage, we will think you'll need to provide 3.3 fewer parking spaces than what normally would be required.
Do we have any accounting of how many on-street parking spaces are available in the city?
We don't stripe the spaces
Okay.
for our on-street parking, but we have a general populating mechanism for on-street based off how long enough a street frontage is, and we do the average.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Backing up from the on-street parking rate to the C2 exemption, so residential still needs to meet the requirements. However, there's that 300-foot rule where if the parking spaces are within 300 feet, they can, again, I go back to the Oxbow because it's still fresh in my mind, but they found a space. They were going to demolish the building and then claim the spaces that would sit in that footprint because it was within 300 feet, but they didn't have access. Like, they didn't have direct access, but per our code, it would still count. And so we ran into this situation where if they used that lot, if you guys recall this, they would have to walk completely around 2 blocks to get to the actual building, but it counted. And I thought at that point we talked about getting rid of that in the code that would allow situations like that to arise. Did we never actually get to that discussion of pulling that out of the code, the 300-foot piece?
It still exists in the code.
Okay.
So apparently, I'm not aware when we discussed about pulling that out of code.
Or maybe amending it to have something about direct access.
Mm-hmm.
I recall this being a thing that we talked about. I just don't know. It's hard to track all the stuff we asked
Right.
for.
It kind of depends on if you're trying to encourage or discourage public parking. Like if we're trying to reduce parking minimums, then it behooves us to lean on the public asset, which is on-street parking or otherwise public parking lots.
Yep.
And so reducing, or I guess heightening the barrier to taking advantage of those assets reduces the reliance on them, obviously. And so I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know what the answer is. Like, obviously, there is some special circumstances related to high-density developments where maybe there's some externality that we need to be managing for in terms of utilization of that public asset.
Yeah.
Um,
So the public asset piece, I'm all for the credit for using like public spaces within a certain radius. The trouble with residential parking versus business parking is a different need.
Yep.
So like the trouble we're seeing in that space is okay, we built the public space, scrap all the stuff about the 300 feet because that didn't end up mattering. But now we have the public parking lot, but they can't park overnight there.
Yep.
So like we're giving them credit for those spaces, like a half, I think it's 0.33 spaces for every public near a residential or something like that, but they can't use them. So like they're credited, but their residents can't park overnight in all the spaces they're getting credit for. So it that's a little cognitive dissonance. And if we're allowing it per the code, but in practical use it doesn't fit, those are the kind of discussions I think we need to start picking these apart, or just removing the minimum and let the market figure it out.
Is Oxbow in C1, or is that in a separate?
It's an R.
No, it is zoned,
R1.
if you look at
R5.
the
Yeah.
map, that's
Yeah,
the
yeah.
wrong one. It
Or
is zoned
down.
residential.
R5.
I'll have to double check, is that R4 or R5?
be
But I think it's either R4 or R5.
Yeah, because, I mean, going back to what you said at the beginning, like, and our housing stock on the avenues is quite small, and a lot of those driveways are not equipped for multiple cars, and just anecdotally, I know people park on the street overnight, like, that's the way it is, and that's not something we want to discourage, but maybe as we're going through this, it would make sense for us to think about introducing some variability in those exemptions depending on the zoning code where it falls. So in R5, maybe this rule looks a little bit different than it does in R1A. If that makes sense.
I think that makes sense. I see what you're talking about. And then, so the number 3 parking reduction mechanism is bicycle parking credit. That is a directed spirit coming from the bike master plan that, our town was encouraging to build a complete bikeable network and for this particular, and tie ourselves in for this particular region. So we, instead of incentivizing them to build bike facilities, we also added it to say for parking reductions. If you provide certain number of bicycle parkings, then we would count extra amount of space for the reduction of the parking requirement. So that's one way of incentivizing it. And I have to say, this is not used, has not been used a lot. And from my observation, I don't think the market is there neither for the amount we established over there. So that's something we can continue to leave in the code since it's not doing any damage or doing anything good neither. We can probably take a look at how we want better incentivize any bike facilities in the future.
Yeah, do you think the market for that changes if we increase the amount of relief for bicycle parking? So instead of like a maximum of up to 15% of the required spaces, if that number goes up? Okay.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I have not had a single project that asked me, can you increase this to 30% of our required parking? It's usually coming with, we want more parking spaces here, instead of saying, how can you help us to meet the parking requirement? They knew most of the developers are driven by the market need because they want to make sure they can lure the tenants in, they can maintain the occupancy rate. So they generally know where the market is. So parking cannot be discussed by itself without talking about the other transportation modes. This is how I would see it, but tonight we're just focusing on parking.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. I do think, developers come to the table looking at our zoning code, and if, depending on what the city wants to see in terms of development, we can express that through the zoning itself. And so if we, for example, we don't want, a big box store going in the erstwhile One North development, and we want more compact style development, I think there is a market for that out there, but we may not be incentivizing or, advertising that that's the kind of development that we want within the zoning code. I'm not saying that is the case, but my curiosity is piqued anyways.
So number 4 is the public parking credit. That's where we talked about any public parking site that's within 600 feet of the subject site. We can basically give you a 50% discount. If you require 10 spaces and you're within 600 of public parking area, you only are required for 5 without counting the other reductions over there. And then number 5 is shared parking. We do encourage shared parking, and this has been very helpful and useful and handy in a lot of ways. Basically what it does is the applicant is required to come up with a study to show how they're going to do a shared parking plan with either their neighbor or of their own businesses with different tenants and at different time. So this one I believe has been very handy. It's a great tool in our toolbox to help incentivizing, minimizing the number of surface parking, but also encourage the efficiency of the use of our parking lot. So that part I would say I would recommend us keep that part. Just to wrap up this particular section really quick about parking reductions, I believe from what I have seen, our code actually does a pretty good job incentivizing people to reduce the number of parking that's being required traditionally. Whether it's successful or not, it's its own story, but we do have a large mechanism here for parking reductions that they could, the private sectors could be considering. And then I would like to talk a little bit about parking lot design. So a lot of people don't really have very in-depth knowledge of the requirements for designing the parking lot. If you were to build a new parking lot today, we would have to apply all these standards to the new parking lot. These standards including locations, size, and landscape. So they're largely involved with where it's located at. We do have a form-based zoning code, and I can kind of talk about that at some other time, but basically what you see in the zoning code is we have walkable ABC, service ABC area. That's based off of the street frontage and depends on where the location is, because we have a different goal of incentivizing people for a certain type of development to encourage the streetscape and encourage the pedestrian experience and to further accommodate our bike master plan and to build a walkable city and a multimodal transportation in our particular city. So the street type itself will provide a location requirement to these parking lot. For example, for a walkable A area that we only we require like a minimum of the street frontage to be occupied by buildings, meaning you cannot have a large surface parking right abutting the street all the way along if you're in a walkable area, because we're trying to encourage the walkability and the pedestrian experience. How do you feel when you walk down a sidewalk when there's constantly cars pulling in and backing in right in front of the sidewalk and maybe go over the bump hand over? That is not an ideal situation. So that's why we have those regulations. And we also have sizes, depends on how many spaces you're providing. Are you building a parking lot providing 10 spaces, 100 spaces, 250 spaces? So different numbers of the parking spaces per parking lot will have different requirements. And that, I think that is, I don't have to go deeper about why. They're obvious because we want to break big parking lot down into smaller ones with more landscape and screening and better service on the particular principal uses on site with a better site design. And then there's landscape requirement. Usually there is a particular strip of buffer that's required for a parking lot. You have seen the school district one, that's the most recent one. And there's also commercial areas where we have landscape buffers, require different species of trees and bushes and where they're located at and how many are there. So those are general requirements for a parking lot design. Other than that, we also have the particular parking dimension requirements for the parking spaces Depends on the angle of the parking, whether you're parallel parking or a 90-degree perpendicular or a 45 angled parking. The requirements are generally a little bit different. We have amended this particular parking dimension, I believe a couple years ago, to allow compact cars. So if you're interested in the requirements over here, it's generally specified out here. Just long story short, at standard parking spaces, we're usually looking at 9 by 18. And for compact ones, we're usually looking at 8 by 15. So just keep that in your mind. And then we might have some future discussions. Like I mentioned earlier, we'll have different plans rolled out in the future. And you gave us some feedback about what we should look into today. Don't hesitate to contact us if you have any particular question about this. And moving forward, I would like to maybe gather some comments from you all about whether or not a discussion session like this make any sense to you. How could we improve? With that said, did you all have other discussion items you wanted to talk about parking?
Just one that I was a little bit passionate about. You just covered a little bit a minute ago on the landscape design. I think I was there when we approved it in the master plan. I think there is a emphasis, or there should be a discussion about moving from a buffering and an aesthetic appearance of our landscape requirements to more of something directly to help reduce our heat island effect that we have. Every time we build a new parking lot, we create a new surface that gets hot all day long, and it sits out there and it cooks. And the people that park there are gone. They don't care. They don't live here, right? They don't have to deal with that or walk by it or anything. So I think this came up at the Oxbow when we made that lot. And at the last minute, we were trying to increase some tree size to get some more shade there, and we couldn't do it because it had to be done immediately, and the standards didn't say that was requirement. So we need to do some research and find out if there's a better way to build a parking lot that would actually, what other cities are doing, and I think maybe try to lead on that a little bit. It's going to get tricky. I don't know how you enforce, calipers of trees. There's probably a lot more to it than what I know, but I think that's something worth looking into so that we actually can address some of the concerns of we just have a lot of paid lots that aren't great for a place to live in when they're just empty.
To piggyback on that one, I remember during that discussion, we got deep in the weeds on like surface types and impervious surfaces versus the ones that'll let water filter through, and cost of maintenance, cost to maintain. And I do recall, like, we were all like really excited about maybe having a pervious surface that would just allow water absorbed through, and then the maintenance on that is insane. Like, you have to basically vacuum the parking lot every couple days to keep it from clogging. Otherwise, it's just what you would have built for a third of the price. So it's there's a lot to it, but absolutely would be interested in finding ways to mitigate that heat island effect, because it's getting, it's 92 degrees in October right now. A couple of things that I'd like to focus in on is gauging the ideas of this body is getting rid of the campus-style exception. I don't see a big benefit to having that in there. The school is the only reason it's there. There's not another campus yet, and there may be, given that one entity owns 90-plus acres in our city, they could eventually establish a campus of some kind, but other than the school and Cerner, that's all that exists in our city, and I don't see the benefit of that exemption to allow for parking to be the accessory use, but to dominate an entire residential lot. So carving that out may work to stop future discussions like we had the other day. And then just further discussion on parking minimums. It would be my goal to just eliminate parking minimums and let the market figure that out. But I see the yin and yang of all of it, pushing parking to the periphery of the city versus having it in our most concentrated, valuable, like real estate parts of the city where, I hate seeing surface lots popping up all over where there could be businesses, buildings, residences. And looking at what have other cities done, I think Little Rock, Arkansas has gone this route where they've eliminated, I might be getting the city wrong, but just eliminated parking minimums and what they're seeing happen. There's also some great YouTube channels that put content out on that. And then the one that is going to get me some pretty nasty emails, I think, is looking at paid parking through the public spaces. The reason I've thought this from this angle is talking with business owners, residents, the police department. We've kind of taken this scattershot approach of like, you can't park overnight in some of these spaces. You can only park for 2 hours in these ones over here, and then you can park for 15 minutes here. And it's just this hodgepodge of, I don't even know if I'm parking in a spot that I'm allowed to at any given time. And then you get a ticket that you didn't intend. The way I see kind of getting around that is being able to dynamically price spaces, and this could go in tandem with the parking management plan that we're rolling out, but being able to appropriately price what the space would be. So if somebody wants to forego paying for on-site parking at the Oxbow, for example, monthly on-site parking, they could park in a public space overnight, but it's going to be X dollars per night. And then at 7 a.m., that changes to an hourly rate. So I know there are meters that can do that, but I want to have that discussion about what's possible to let a market-driven solution help us with our parking issues.
Just so, I think all those are very good brainstorming. The paid parking discussion will probably happen at the council level. I don't think it will be a zoning requirement, because zoning generally deals with the uses, whether we require, how much we require, and in what shape, format we require. But it doesn't really talk about, we require $1 per day, $10 per day, per hour.
That's
Zoning,
fair.
that's not a zoning functionality. So that will be in different titles of the municipal code. That's just what I would like to mention.
Sure.
So particularly, I want to say this board would not say if anything changes for that paid parking, it will probably not come to this particular commission to look at that.
Any further questions from commissioners? Good deal. Thank you very much, staff. Good report. Moving on, comments from staff. With the conclusion of all items to be discussed tonight, are there any other comments from staff?
Well, thank you all for being here tonight. We always wanted to look to improve our zoning code and the enforcement. With that said, we do have another case that I believe will call for a planning commission meeting in November. So if you know particularly you can or cannot make it, please let Megan know. We would really appreciate it. We want to make sure we have a quorum. With that, thank you all for being here tonight. It's great to see you all.
Thank you, Shu. Any closing comments from commissioners?
I'll just say thank you for putting this together. I know it wasn't an easy presentation to throw together, and you dug deep in the code and found all the applicable pieces. So thank you for putting that together.
Right, yeah, I mean, this is good information. I don't know that I know enough yet to talk about it intelligently, other than, like Councilman Smith mentioned and others, that this approach that we have, obviously, about parking lots isn't good in a lot of ways. From my perspective, I live at 30th and Swift. From practically mid-May to almost September, there's a lot of parking that's not used. And it's just a gigantic heat reflection, you know, in our city. So I would like to come back to it and talk about any one of these in more depth. But thank you for putting it together.
Any further comments? Okie dokie. Seeing as all of tonight's business has been completed, is anybody moved to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
We are now adjourned.
Drew was aggressive with the a gunshot went off when he started the meeting. He's like, we're going to bring this meeting to BAM! Order at 6:01. Firm but fair. Yeah.
we've got.